At Flushing, Long Island, the General Assembly of the United Nations has made its decision on Palestine. The map shows what partition means. The Jewish state colored light, the Arab state dark, Jaffa to go to the Arabs, Jerusalem internationalized.
My name is Richard Dix, and this is How Did That Happen? A podcast where I look at everyday things or events and try to figure out how they came to be. Every week I will research one topic, and by the end of the episode, I hope to truly have the answer to the question, how did that happen? All right, and welcome back to another episode of How Did That Happen? HDTH coming at you here, episode number 82. We've got the Israel-Hamas Conflict Part 2. A little bit unexpected if you're listening to the last episode of this podcast. I wasn't sure going into it that we'd have a Part 2. This is the actual first Part 2 of any podcast episode in the history of HDTH. So that's something. That's great. Look at us moving right along. Here, we're going to talk about some more of the conflict, the history behind it. We're going to unwrap and unfold some things and really kind of explain. I think on this one, we're really going to get down to, I think, one of the main issues at hand. And I can't give it away because then, you wouldn't listen further. But skip on down if you don't want to hear what I got to say now to get to that. This is the beginning. So we're going to talk about a little bit of housekeeping we got going on here. What am I watching? I just watched the movie Cellular, which I've seen before. It came out like 20 years ago. But it was recently done on one of my favorite podcasts that I watch called How Did This Get Made? Which is a pod that watches bad movies and talks about them afterwards. It's like this whole idea of like they were so bad. How did this movie even get made? The movie stars Chris Evans and Kim Basinger. Chris Evans' character picks up his call from a science teacher mom who's been kidnapped and held in an attic. Since the police won't help, he is tasked with saving her and her family, all while still staying on the phone. And it's a good movie. It's a good movie. I watched it because they covered it on the podcast that I listened to. I think I found it on YouTube. It is very, very interesting. And I usually have what am I listening to? I'm not really listening to too much different. And if you've listened to this podcast for a while, the initial iteration of what am I listening to used to actually be what am I reading? Because I go through spurts of reading and not reading. But recently I just finished a book that was lent to me by a friend. It was called The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis. And it is a very good book. I would recommend it to anybody who's interested in politics in any way. It covers basically the transition, the presidential transition between Obama and Trump and all the different government agencies that were kind of waiting for them the Trump team to come in and kind of learn about what was going on. In addition to that, it kind of uses that as the foundation to kind of jump off and talk about a couple of different issues that are plaguing the American kind of machine and all the different people who are in control of, the government places that have issues with the problems that they see, throughout the government. It's really good. They cover the USDA, they cover the DOE, a lot of different stuff. And he's also the guy who wrote The Blind Side. So I don't know. I want to read that as well. Because I've watched the movie. I think we've all watched the movie, but now hearing what the guy actually has to say, what the football player has to say about what the way the family was and the way his life ended up being, I would love to go back and read that and see if, I don't know. Like I full disclosure, I had it checked out at the library for the last couple of weeks and have not had a chance to get to it. It's now been gone back. So that's pretty much it for the what am I watching, what am I reading. Check out the bite-sized bios, guys. They're pretty good. We are approaching episode 40. Our last episode 39, was on Che Guevara. We learned a lot of things about him. We learned his life before becoming a revolutionary. We learned that he was part Irish and also a doctor. And the only reason he kind of ended up being one of the main revolutionaries is because when they initially came over to retake Cuba on that boat named Grandma, basically everybody died but him and like 12 dudes. And so he goes from being the doctor of the troop to being one of the leaders. I mean, it's a little bit more than that, but that's one of the main things that happens that kind of pushes him into that role. But yeah, that was what we covered last week. Got a few more, for this series that we're going to get to before we get out of the series as far as the people that we profile. But yeah, it's been really good. That's every other Monday at 4:30 a.m. I hope you guys have been checking out the TikTok over there. We're at HDT Happen 22. Things have been cooking up pretty well, getting some likes, getting some follows. We're just doing some different things. I'm putting out some. Really, what I'm trying to do is find the juiciest parts of this podcast, right? and putting it out to the masses to show what's really happening over here. This is how we do it. This is how we find out how things happen at this podcast. Yeah, find us everywhere that you do social media pretty much. We got an Instagram, there's a Twitter, I have a Tumblr, there's Tumblr's not doing that well. But yeah, we got HDTH.com is where the main website is. Going to try to keep beefing that up and adding some things, but you'll find all the extras and all the works cited over there for all that good stuff. Don't think there's much else to say before we get into it. I do want to say, I guess for timestamp here, because we're talking about a fairly sensitive subject. Today is November the 5th. We are almost a month into the Israel-Hamas conflict. I mean, Israel has now started their ground invasion. It's been going on for the past few days. There's been a lot of casualties on the Palestinian side, specifically the Gaza area has been bombed a lot. But yeah, I just want to say that because if you listen to this and you wonder, when is this being recorded? Is how much information is being shared at whatever time? That's just for anybody who wants to know or would like to have that information. But yeah, before we get into it, I always want to say, because we are talking about fairly sensitive information, I'm not trying to offend anybody. That's not the goal here. What our main goal here, and why this is so important, I think, to this podcast, is to just find out how things happen from a very objective helicopter standpoint sort of point of view. It's not about who did what and let us judge them. It's about what are the reactions from these actions, and that's what we're really finding when we really go back and look at the different wars and conflicts that got us to this point. But yeah, before we get on the ramble train here, let's go ahead and get into the episode. So without further ado, as we know to do, here is the episode.
Senor Arana of Brazil, presiding, calls on the nations to vote and announces how they vote.
Saudi Arabia? No. Soviet Union? Yes. United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes.
The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
In 1947, the UN kind of created a plan, the partition plan. It was the UN partition plan, and it was voted on by a bunch of countries, a bunch of different countries. I have all of them here. Let's see, 33 countries voted in favor, which was 72% of the entire vote. We're talking countries like Brazil, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Paraguay, Uruguay, Belgium, Denmark, Australia, Philippines, the U.S. of course. They all voted for this to happen. There were some people that voted against it. By people I mean countries. And but when this happened, the Arabs were not very pleased with this. This wasn't the way they thought it was supposed to go. Which none of this really for them from the end of World War I went anywhere like what they thought it was supposed to go. So once this happened, they didn't agree to it. They didn't want it. This was not what they wanted. The Jewish people in Palestine were very happy. They were celebrating this idea because it basically gave them the official kind of go ahead, the nod to go ahead and make Israel.
The Jewish people at once began to celebrate the United Nations decision. If they hadn't got all they wanted, they had at least gained the verdict for the setting up of a new Jewish state, and their rejoicing was obviously a spontaneous affair. Such was the immediate Jewish reaction in Jerusalem, and it was the same in Tel Aviv and elsewhere.
And that's what would basically happen. Not too long after this, Britain would withdraw their control of the British Mandated Palestine, and literally the minute that they do that, Israel declares their independence in 1948. The first prime minister is a man by the name of David Ben-Gurion. At midnight on the 15th of May 1948, the British mandate was officially terminated and the state of Israel came into being several hours later. Nobody liked that, really, in that area. The Arab states, I think it was Iraq, Egypt, Syria, and Transjordan, they invaded the newborn state of Israel and attacked a bunch of Jewish settlements. And this kind of is what will begin the first Arab-Israeli War of 1948. And this is really where the tensions start to pick up as far as specifically clashing these two factions going back and forth. What you have before is, Britain is kind of there overseeing their bickering back and forth, and it's really all it was bickering, because there was nothing that was set in stone. Nothing, there was, depending on how you look at it, but that what they were fighting for became much more serious once the UN created that partition plan that was then, kind of turned down by the Arabs and then honored by everybody else, and that's kind of what would really happen. So, like I said, the midnight happens on May the 15th, 1948. Israel becomes its own state. All the Arab countries around them don't like that. They invade them. Then starts the war. They go back and forth for a while. There's a lot of killing. It's war, you know. There definitely was war, and I would say that this war that we're discussing right now, the initial Arab-Israeli war, was much more a war than what we're experiencing now. And I don't want to get, too much into the here and now, but it's this is two types of people going back and forth and fighting over, land that they still haven't completely outlined. Even though there was a map, the map that was created by the UN it's not the one they would end up going with, and it tried to do Jerusalem somewhat the same way they did Berlin after World War II. Where they had I think it was considered to be a special zone, something like that, where a lot of different countries would have access to it. So this would end up not being the case. And so, I mean, truthfully, the war itself was was for Palestine, was for trying to decide who would have control over that area, but it was fought, I would say almost mainly by all of the exterior Arab countries. And so how it would actually end would be with armistice that would be signed with those countries in 1949. It wasn't like they ever actually signed anything with the Palestinians, because they weren't the ones that were specifically fighting per se. I mean, they were definitely there, and I think they were definitely the ones that were dying too. But as far as the armies themselves, I believe it was much more of the Syria, Transjordan, and Egypt, because Egypt was one of the main people who signed on the armistice in 1949 in Lebanon. Let's see, Transjordan did it as well. What was it? They did February, Egypt did it, and then March, Transjordan did it. And Syria did it in April. So basically, that was at that point. That's how they kind of get to a stopping point. We're no longer fighting right now. We're kind of just gonna be like, all right, we're not as mad as we were, about what we were mad about before. The armistice demarcation lines as set by the agreement saw the territory under Israeli control encompassing approximately 3/4 of the prior British administered mandate as it stood after Transjordan's independence in 1946. And at that time, Israel would end up controlling territories of about 1/3 more than what was allocated to them in the Jewish state under the UN partition proposal. And that's something that we really I do want to talk about, because I feel like that is one of the things that is I think truthfully one of the tentpoles of what's happening right now, of why of the beginning of the disenfranchisement of the Palestinian people. Truthfully, there's a great documentary that I think you guys might want to check out. It's called Tentura, and it is it's completely in Hebrew, so get ready to read some subtitles. But that's what makes it also so gripping. And it's about, truthfully, around this time. This is what happens in the documentary is there's person interviews. How can I put this? The Jewish people come through. The IDF basically comes through and removes a bunch of Arab Palestinian people from their land so that they can make room for the new amounts of Jewish people that will show up to the new state of Israel. And I wanted to make some of the audio clips from the documentary available for this podcast, but like I said, it's in Hebrew, so unless you know Hebrew, it won't be helpful to you at all. But what I did find was an interview from the director. His name's Alan Schwartz. Get the right. It's Alan Schwartz. Yeah, Alan Schwartz. And he speaks in English about what's going on in the documentary. I think I'm going to play a little bit of that for you now.
He basically brought testimonies from soldiers and other stuff, documents that pointed to a massacre occurring there. Namely, the battle ending, some Israeli soldiers got killed, some Palestinians got killed, but then there were men of the village that were executed in cold blood when they were unarmed. That's
according to this fellow Katz.
Teddy Katz.
Yeah. So when they do this, they kill some of these people. They rape some of these people. They do all of the things. I mean, literally, I would even almost it's down to it's not a mirror image, but when you look at what they did, what the Jews did to the Palestinians in 1948 when they were removing them from their land, is the exact same things that was done to them on October the 7th. And I'm not trying to put any sort of comparison, like to say one is bad or worse than the other. I'm saying, but I think it's not a coincidence. You know, when I was watching this documentary and you hear about how these people were massacred in the same way, I mean, literally down to the idea of throwing a grenade into a bomb shelter, and then when the people that run out, you shoot them, you kill them. That was the same thing that was done to the Palestinians when they were removed from the land that was then used to build kibbutzes on.
And in Israel, we don't want to look at that. We don't want to be accountable for that. We don't take responsibility for that. We tell ourselves myth, for example, that they all ran away. Ask most Israelis like me before this film, you know, what happened in 1948? How do these Palestinians suddenly leave? And we'll say, oh, they ran away. They ran away by themselves. So we tell ourselves these sugar-coated
Well, wasn't
stories.
part of that true? Weren't they encouraged by some of the leadership, many of them, to run away and to leave? No, I'm asking you.
Probably also, but
Okay.
but most of them, if you look at it, ran away when they saw a campaign that included massacres, that included scaring them. And when you burn and when you massacre a village and tell the villagers to go to the next village and tell their neighbors, that creates panic. And that was a pretty orchestrated campaign, I think.
Those are facts. That's not speculation. And that's why this documentary is so important, is because the person in this documentary interviews all parties involved. He interviews the Palestinians that were removed. He interviews the Jewish IDF that removed them. Then he interviews the people who moved in after them and lived on their land today, modernly. This documentary was made maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. Very modern, and it's going to cost you. I think that's, you know, there's a little bit of a paywall there. I think it's $2 to rent on Amazon, but it is so worth it. It is so worth it if you want to have any sort of real idea about what's going on right now. And I say that without this being any sort of propaganda. Like I said, this documentary is in Hebrew. They're Jewish people doing this documentary, but they're talking about what's going on. So you just want to have the full scope. You want to understand, want to really see, you know, the foundation of it. That's what's happening. And this is right around the exact timeline that we're talking about right now in 1948 in the Arab-Israeli War. This is why these people are so mad. This is one of the temples and the structure of how it did happen. How did that happen? This is one of the ways that it happened. Right after the UN said, this is what you can have, right? Here's a plan. We're going to partition it. You get some, you get some. The Arabs are so mad, somewhat understandably, because basically the world comes together and gives away their land. So you can think about it, and obviously you can look at it in hindsight and say, hey, you probably should have taken what they gave you, and you might be better off now. But obviously hindsight's 2020, right? We don't know what's going to happen. But initially what happens to you is you're sitting there in your land that you've lived on for years, hundreds and hundreds. Your family's lived there for hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years. And then this newly formed organization they come together and they say, hey, you know what? We're going to give most of this to somebody else, right? But you get some, right? Don't be mad. You mad? Don't be mad. Oh, he's mad. They're mad. And they just stay mad, understandably, for the next 70 years. But it goes on because not only do they lose some of the land, they lose even more land. Like they even said that Jewish people came in and took more than a third more than what they were initially given in the UN partition plan. So that is the Arab-Israeli War 1948. We get the armistice, right? That stops everything. Things cool off for a few years. About, 5-6 years. We get to the mid-50s. Well, I guess before we get there, I will, read to you the full devastation of what the biggest issue that arose from the Arab-Israeli War, the Civil War in Mandatory Palestine, which has come to be known in certain circles. It says that around 750,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes, Tantura, out of approximately 1.2 million that lived in Palestine. This is known as the Nakba. Now, this is interesting. This is stuff that you can't make up. So Nakba, right, is considered to be a catastrophe, right? I believe it's the Arab word for catastrophe. Don't at me. I think it might be.
The Palestinians have been telling us about the Nakba for forever. The Israelis don't.
The Nakba, just for the audience,
Yep.
They don't know what that is.
The Nakba is the Arabic word, is an Arabic word for catastrophe, but it's used by the Palestinians to describe the tragedy they had in 1948, basically 750 or so thousand people got thrown out of Israel. What is today Israel?
The catastrophe, it's often translated, okay?
Yes.
Whereby the Israelis call it the War of Liberation or the War of Independence.
But so basically that's it, but it's known as that because this is basically the worst kind of time that's ever happened in the Palestinian people's history. So it's the Nakba is what they call it. And so and just for context, we can kind of juxtapose these and put them right beside each other. The Israeli Day of Independence is that they celebrate on the same day that the Palestinians celebrate Nakba, because literally they're celebrating the exact same thing, just the other side of it. Or no, I mean, they're not celebrating the same thing, but they are both making their I guess the Jews are celebrating it and the Palestinians are mourning it the exact same day. So in the same time, the same area, these people are literally looking at the same event on both sides, and it's on one side they have fireworks, on the other side they have, I guess, some really sad prayers. But I just thought that was so, I don't know, it's just, none of it feels right. And I would really truthfully, if you have any issue with anything that I've said, which I hope people don't, because I don't think I've said anything really salacious, but go check out that documentary, man. Go check out Tentura, and then try to have the same feeling that and then try to watch the news the same way. Because it's just like, I don't know. I don't think that it was, check out Tentura. So, yes, 750,000, like I said, Palestinians were removed from during that time, and it just kept on growing. Then we get into the 50s here. I just want to kind of cover that for a second, because that is one of the biggest things that happens from that war specifically. You know, we get the actual laid out concrete line of what should be the Palestine and Israel, but then Israel kind of tells the world what it's actually going to be, and then we kind of live with that. And to be completely honest with you, we've been living with that for the last 75 years. And so, like I said, things cool off until like the mid-50s, and that's when we get to the Suez Crisis, which is 1956, otherwise known as the Second Arab-Israeli War. And this is about the Suez Canal. I think what happens is the Suez Canal is controlled by the Egyptians. They stop letting in Israeli ships and stuff. And actually, I think before they realize it's going to be seized, and they end up sinking like 40-something ships in there to like sabotage them. But what happens, I think, is that the United Kingdom, France, and Israel, they invade Egypt to try to get back control of the Suez Canal. Their aim, like I said, was to regain control for the Western powers and to remove Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had just nationalized the foreign-owned Suez Canal Company, which nobody liked. Once they did this, though, the other big guys in the international world were like, "Hey, no, guys, stop. We don't get down like that." You know, the U.S., the Soviet Union, and the UN were all, no, we're like, please don't. Which is wild when both the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War can agree on something. You must have really messed up. And what they say, I mean, it didn't look good on any of those guys. The UK, France, or Israel, but it was said to be one of the last real things that showed that the UK was no longer a large world power the way that they had been. Because I guess a couple hundred years ago, or even 100 to 50 years ago, whatever the UK did would have probably just been like, all right, well, they're doing that. I mean, similar to how it's happening, not similar, but somewhat to how it's happening in Israel, where we can just say, I mean, wholesale killings that I have a hard time reconciling with the stuff that happened on October the 7th. I mean, they go back every time that they show these bombings that are happening in Gaza, and they say, yes, 1,400 people were killed, and raped and murdered in Israel, and that is so true. That is 100% true, and it is wrong, and it's bad. But does 10,000 dead people, does that equate? It's a question that I've been asking myself a lot, and an answer that I haven't yet to come up with. I do not know. I don't know. As far as like internally for me, it's a question I ask myself. I don't know. Like yes, you want to get back at them, right? You want to get back at whoever did the things to you, and that makes sense. You want retribution. You want revenge, right? You want both of those things. I feel like they're two different things. Revenge is getting back at them. Retribution is getting like equity, like a backup version of what you lost, which I do feel like does require the death toll to be higher than what you lost. You know what I mean? 3,000 would make sense. 4,000, 5,000. I think we're approaching 9. Like I said, closer to 5 or 10,000 people have been killed. And so, what is the number before? Not before you give up, because I don't think they'll give up. And I don't mean to kind of go on a tangent about this, but I do try to find the through ways to bring it back to talking about the actual conflict that is at hand right now. But when do they give up, and how many people are too many before it's how many buildings do you blow up to get to the tunnels that end up killing another 700 people? Is it worth it? Is it worth it? I'm asking. I don't know. I'm not a general. Thankfully, I'm not tasked with that decision. I get to sit back in America and just have these questions and say things like this. But, I mean, I hope someone's asking that question. I hope someone's got a number handy, 15, 20,000, 25. We're not far away, but we've gotten far too off. So we're back in the Suez, back in 1956, the Suez Crisis. That happens. The UK's got poo on their face. Everybody's like, why'd you do that, bro? But Israel would end up getting, access back to it. And I think the UN would kind of step in and kind of, make sure everybody plays nice. But that would be the end of that. That was 1956. So right now we've covered 2 wars that are, I think, integral to understanding the overall, idea of what's happening right now. And the last one I think that we'll get to for this one is the 6-Day War. And so the 6-Day War, which can also be considered the third Arab-Israeli war. And that's why I feel like this stuff is really necessary. We're on our third Arab-Israeli war, and Israel as a country has not existed for 20 full years yet. So you have to look at this stuff to fully understand the ground in front of you. You can't just look at this in 2023 and just be like, oh, well, what CNN said or this one article I read. You've got to go back and look at it. And I think even with this one, I think there will be a part 3 for this. I've been thinking about it. I'm not sure how I'm gonna work it in there, because I would like to get back a little bit to what we've been doing, because I have a lot of stuff. I mean, we're supposed to talk about the MLK's assassination. I have that episode ready to go. I have a lot of stuff that we're still in that series, but this I do feel is pertinent. It's interesting, and it's a nice exercise. I'm just trying to see where the podcast can go and what it can be. But I say that to say, in part 3 we're going to cover the stuff after this. I mean, obviously, but like the in the 80s and then into the 90s and stuff that happens in the early 2000s, which also does play a large part in it. But this is the beginning. This is the back and forth of just like from the moment Israel becomes a nation, all the countries around it are like no, like just emphatically no. And so in 1967, specifically June, they call it the June War sometimes. This war was fought between Israel and a coalition of Arab states. Once again, mainly just Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. It was fought from June 5th to June 10th. Escalated hostilities broke out amid poor relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors following the 1949 armistice agreements, which ended the first Arab-Israeli war. So basically, nobody was cool when they said they were cool 20 years ago. Everybody's still mad. They didn't love the stuff that happened a few years earlier. 1956. So, or excuse me, after depending on where we're going on the timeline, they didn't like what happened during the Suez Crisis. So basically, just tensions continue to just build up and boil over. And so these guys go back and forth for the next 5 to 6 days, and eventually the UN would come in and broker a deal. They would broker a ceasefire, but the damage was done. After the 6-day war, Israel would almost triple in size. They would get all of the hot button names that you hear now, that people talk about now. This is why this war is so important. This is how they get Gaza. This is how Israel gets Gaza. This is how Israel gets the Golan Heights. This is how Israel gets the West Bank. This these 6 days right here, I think you have to understand, are very crucial to what's happening right now. They are literally one of the main issues as to why the Arabs and Israelis can't get along, is how this war ended in 1967. Now, obviously, we're going to cover some things in the next part, so I don't want to just jump the gun too much, but they wouldn't maintain control of all of these different areas as time would go on. They would end up giving back certain pieces, but this is where you go from, the first Arab-Israeli war, which comes right after the UN partition plan in 1947, right? This is very fresh. The moment that the British people pull out of Palestine, Israel's like, we're a state now, we're a sovereign state, and then boom, they get into a war, right? They end that war. 8 years later, they're in another war. Same people in that war. 11 years later, another war. This war goes even better than all the other wars. If you could say war goes good, they end up tripling their actual land size, and they end up getting all these different places. And this is what will continue to be a point of contention for all of the Arab nations. They were so mad at themselves that they lost this war that they all got together and decided that they were not going to basically, recognize them as a country for a long time. And there's so many different pieces to this. There's one last tangent, I think, before we get out of here. Just if I can mention what I've been kind of figuring out, is that during this time, and I think maybe even still now, that the Palestinian people were left with no real citizenship, because their citizenship wouldn't be recognized by the Arab nations, because they thought by not doing that, they were kind of leaving it open for them to come back and reclaim Israel. So it really left these Palestinians really being almost a nationless people, which I thought when I read that, I thought that was remarkable. I mean, it's just because it's you don't think of it. It's almost like shooting yourself in the foot, in a sense. But yeah, I mean, it cannot be understated how important the 6-day war is to what's happening right now in the Israel-Hamas conflict. All right, that was part 2 of the Israel-Hamas conflict. Learned a lot. I think this was it's worth doing. It was worth doing the second part and breaking it up, because I feel like we were able to. I don't think I would have covered half as much of this time had I not have chosen to do a second episode of this. We learned a lot about the 6-day war, the initial Arab-Israeli war as well. They all have their different pieces and why they're important, and that we talked, just before the episode was ending, about the 6-day war in 1967. That one was, I would say, the most important, because we were really still dealing with the issue of whether or not the land acquisition during that time by Israel was what should have happened. The countries that occupy that region are still asking themselves that question, and they're going back and forth about it. And you could argue that that's one of the main reasons that they're fighting even now. So it's good to kind of cover this stuff and talk about it in depth a little bit. I think it was really interesting to finally get, because I was really trying to find a way to convey the depth of the documentary that I watched, the Tantura, without, I couldn't do it without showing it or bringing it in the podcast. But it is completely in Hebrew. So it was just, the only way I could do it was to get the director and hear his interview, which I think was very interesting. You can find the entire thing. Will be on the Works Cited. It's about a 35-minute interview where he really does kind of just lay out in English, thankfully, the importance of the documentary itself. So, yeah, hope you guys like that. There will be a part 3. Like I said, I'm not sure if it's going to be the next HDTH, because sadly I think that this will be a drawn out thing. So I think there'll be time in the next few weeks to cover another one. We want to get to the stuff that happens in the 80s and 90s. We can talk about the PLO, Yasser Arafat, all that good stuff. We're going to get there. But yeah, thank you guys for pressing play. You can find any of the extras on HDThappen.com. All the socials are at HDThappen, except for TikTok, which is at HDThappen22. Give us 5 stars wherever you find this. If you liked it, if you didn't like it, give us 2 stars. Tell us why you didn't like it, because constructive criticism is always welcome. Always thankful for people that come back and press play from week to week. This was your first time listening. I do appreciate that as well. And we'll see you next week with the next bite-sized bio.